Hi, everybody, and welcome to the final session of Category Palooza 2022. Thank you so much for being with us for the last, 3 hours plus of insights that we've had from lots of experts across a number of different organizations, really shared a wealth of knowledge and information with us. Now, this last session is going to be with my good friend, Rich Ham. Rich is the CEO of Fine-Tune, and we're going to be talking about catalysts for supplier competition, how to get suppliers to fight for your business. We're going to have a little bit of time where Rich is going to share some thoughts, probably for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to come back together for a panel discussion where I'm going to bring Helen and Kelly with me, so we all four of us can kind of have a conversation around the topic and some of the insights that Rich shared with us. So let me kick off, Rich, and just welcome you, first of all, to the stage here.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here.
So my first question for anybody that doesn't know who you are, what you do, I wonder if you could just give me, the quick elevator pitch of your role, your responsibilities.
Sure. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fine-Tune. We're a niche expense management solution focused on a small handful of the most complex and burdensome indirect services. We frequently call these expenses nuisance expenses, but we're deeply immersed in a small handful of the most complex services. Started our business back in January of 2002, actually officially incorporated February 1 of 2002 after I left a job with the industry leading supplier in the United States, Cintas. At that time, we focused only on that niche, the uniform and industrial laundering industry, but we've since expanded to kind of become deeply immersed in also the waste and recycling industry, the security and guard services industry, the pest control industry, and a handful of others that are kind of slowly being added to our suite of service offerings.
Well, Rich, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the floor. I'm going to give you our stage here, and I look forward to listening to some of the tips, advice that you have to share, and we'll be back with you to ask some questions. I encourage everybody in the audience who's watching, please do send those questions in. We do stack them up here and get to as many of them as we can as we get to the Q&A and the panel session at the end. So, Rich, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Phil. And let me start by congratulating and thanking Phil, Kelly, Helen, and everyone associated with Art of Procurement for, first of all, for consistently putting out fantastic content for this community. Over the last few hours, your attendees have gleaned a good many valuable insights within the realm of effective category management. And no surprise there, obviously, as always, great work by the Art of Procurement team. But as we wrap up the event today, it feels incumbent upon me to circle back up out of kind of the niche discussions we've had to the big picture. And as I've consumed today, my mind keeps returning to, honestly, some harsh realities. And I think these harsh realities are likely to dominate the early portions of my talk this afternoon. I promise it won't all be dark clouds. And I think especially when Kelly and Helen and Phil rejoin me towards the end, we will talk about solutions, about finding some ways to walk between the raindrops, so to speak. But I think that, Phil, your followers come to you for the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. And so here is the big picture, that harsh reality, the big truth as I see it. For a variety of reasons that I'm going to lay out, there is today in 2022 an alarming and growing imbalance of power between buyers and sellers in the marketplace. And this power imbalance has already eroded procurement's effectiveness, and it threatens to erode it further still. Now, my observations come from ground level in the indirect services arena. But my sense from talking with clients and peers is that this truth extends across nearly all industries. Your suppliers, and I'm speaking now to your community, your suppliers have gained the upper hand, and now they're moving in for the kill. Let me say, all is not lost, however, and there is much that practitioners in the industry in general can do to reclaim lost power, and today's session provides some great examples. category insights of the sort that today's session shared with attendees are hugely useful. And general mastery of procurement and continued learning and refinement of best practices, the kind of stuff you get all the time from Art of Procurement, is also hugely useful. Staying on the cutting edge of emerging technologies for helping overburden procurements augment their in-house capability, that's really useful too. It's critical. But even the most informed and experienced professionals, armed with the best tools, are at a severe disadvantage in 2022. And in many cases, all the knowledge and skills and tools in the world are still proving inadequate to overcome the macro level forces at play against procurement's effectiveness in this climate. The headwinds are gale force, and they are strengthening. What headwinds am I talking about? Let's dive in. And let's start by, to put today's challenges in context, I think it's worth reflecting for a moment on what life was like for the average category manager in 2007. I'm sure many of today's attendees worked in the field 15 years ago, but others are probably new to the game. And so this seems like a good place to start. In 2007, departmental resources, headcount, were dramatically more robust on a per dollar under management basis. In 2007, procurement teams were, generally speaking, able to stay on top of the categories they managed. And by stay on top of, I don't mean just get contracts out the door on time regularly. I mean they were able to get down into the weeds, gaining an understanding of what suppliers were charging them for and why. And getting out the field, relationships with teammates, building security with them, and kind of gathering strength for the next marketplace activity. And when that marketplace activity came around, there were 4, 5, even 6 viable national suppliers competing for the business. It's how category management works when there's a balance of power. And procurement and buyers in general were wielding significant power in these times. But 2008 brought the Great Recession, and cost-cutting pressures homed in on corporate offices. Procurement departments were aggressively targeted. Many other departments were too. And even as healthier economic times returned, procurement departmental resources never really returned. In many cases, they were leaned out even further. And at best, departmental growth failed to keep pace with overall company growth. And so by 2019, in comparison with 2007, I would argue that the average procurement professional was being asked to do the work of 2 to 3 people. Now, this reality of leaned out procurement departments brought on a host of vulnerabilities, which should be obvious. If you have less in the way of resources, you're going to be vulnerable. And so a few examples of these. One, inability to engage in any sort of actual expense management after deals go live. Another, a difficulty in cultivating relationships with internal stakeholders and teammates. Third, a lack of time to transition away from problematic suppliers. And finally, a necessity brought on by leanness of placing outsized value on convenience, often at the expense of the bottom line. Now, I want to park a moment to acknowledge that somewhere in the years immediately following the Great Recession, we began to see the erosion of the single most tool in a procurement professional's toolbox: the threat of lost business. This threat is, of course, what forces suppliers to behave as if they're in a competitive environment. If your supplier triples their prices or can't provide adequate products or services, you can take your business elsewhere. That threat forces the supplier to offer product, services, and costs. It's an concept to this audience, and yet the importance of the threat of lost business cannot be overstated. The balance of power between buyers and sellers relies so heavily on buyers wielding this weapon. And yet, from 2008 to 2019, resource-strapped procurement departments dealing not only with more spend, but also with increasingly complex spend. It was often spend that was the product of acquisition fueled growth with tentacles reaching into years past, into legacy acquisitions. They started to feel that the threat of lost business was becoming harder and harder to wield. Now, remember that for the threat of lost business to work, it must be a plausible threat. And as suppliers came to understand the extent to which their customers were inundated with work, they slowly began to sense that the threat of lost business had begun to dwindle. I'm going to come back to this subject later. Let's put a pin in that for now. So, of course, suppliers were taking note of all the vulnerabilities created by leaned out procurement teams, and they figured out that departments were overburdened and understaffed. And they began developing, and continue developing over the years, a massive range of strategies to grow margins and further erode procurement's effectiveness. Basically, what I'm saying is this: your suppliers caught on to the fact that you were drinking from a fire hose. They figured out that all you were equipped to do was get contracts out the door before moving on to the next urgent task. And so they naturally turned their attention to render contracts less and less relevant. And it worked. All the supplier tactics that were being developed in response to leaned out procurement caused this phenomenon that we came to call good contract, bad deal to become pervasive. And, I want to explain the concept a little bit, and let's start with just what a contract is in a very literal sense. It's words on paper, an electronic file. It's a means of promoting outcomes, but it's certainly not an outcome in and of itself. A contract sits in a file folder on a machine. It can't do things. It can't enforce itself. It can't audit. It can't control or even really encourage optimal behavior by, say, field personnel. There are quite literally limits to what a contract can do. And so your suppliers were having great success finding myriad ways to attack bottom lines around the defenses of contracts. The good contract still sits in the file folder where it lives, and out in the field where invoices are coming in and checks are flying out the door. You're paying 30 to 40% above optimal market cost levels. You've still got a good contract, but you've got a bad deal. Throughout the indirect services arena, and I think throughout the entire indirect world, increasingly, even on the direct side, good contract, bad deal is not some occasional phenomenon. It's the norm. Okay, so coming back from that little side journey, I can't stress this enough. Everything I just laid out about the evolution of the balance of power from 2008 onward was already true as 2019 came to a close. Procurement's ability to drive real lasting P&L value had been dramatically eroded over a decade plus. And now here comes 2020 and a global pandemic, further eroding procurement's bandwidth as a host of new and urgent priorities were foisted upon already strapped departments. And don't think for a moment that your suppliers failed to capitalize on your lack of bandwidth during the pandemic, on your ability to actually manage them. We've got a host of examples here, but my favorite is in the security guard services arena, where guard services providers were magically turning $18 to $20 an hour security guards into $75 an hour guards by equipping them with the advanced skill of holding a thermometer up to employees' foreheads as they entered a facility. Temperature screening was a good business to be in there for a few months. Oh, and God forbid that those $75 an hour temperature screening guards were working overtime, because if they were, those hours ran you north of $110. It's also worth noting here, I think, that the pandemic also provides another critical demarcation point on the long, slow erosion of the threat of lost business. The new and urgent priorities heaped upon procurement made consuming supplier transitions even less manageable than they had been in 2019. And probably it's worth noting, too, that health and safety concerns created by the pandemic also forestalled and even nixed many potential supplier transitions. And a tidal wave of short-term extensions of dubious supplier deals were executed. Probably a lot of heads just nodded in the room like, yeah, I did extend a lot of deals by 1 year when I really wished I could have dove in and taken a deeper dive into that particular expense, done something smarter and more strategic with that contract. But I just had to whip a pen across a 1 year extension because I didn't have time. For the most part, you weren't taking your business elsewhere, and your suppliers, they figured this out. So then, after all that, an acute inflationary cycle was piled on top of the pandemic. And while there has been very real inflation over the last couple of years, once again, your suppliers are capitalizing on the crisis. The US's leading waste haulers provide a great example of this. Their stocks are trading near all-time highs. Revenues and earnings are up dramatically right through the pandemic. And yet, in recent weeks, double-digit percentage price increase demands have gone out to customers nationwide, despite the fact that essentially all of this industry's contracts already have very specific index-based provisions, which have been keeping the haulers whole right through this inflationary cycle. Don't take my word for it, by the way. Their public financials and quarterly earnings reports tell the story. You, the customer, have been bracing for cost increases. Your suppliers know this, and they recognize this as the perfect moment for margin grabbing, securing increases vastly greater than the increases in cost that they are incurring. This is happening across industries. This entire sequence of events, going back to the Great Recession, has shifted the balance of power to procurement's detriment. And now, in 2022, the power imbalance is worsening in real time. Supplier industry consolidation has left fewer and fewer good options. Where 4 to 6 options might have existed in 2007, 2 to 3 less attractive options tend to remain. Perhaps no single factor, by the way, has more directly contributed to the erosion of the threat of lost business than supplier industry consolidation. Simply put, when companies are able to scare up the resources and determination to make a supplier change, even then, the options are fewer and they're often less appealing than they were a mere decade ago. When a particular industry only has 2 viable national suppliers and you've had a bad experience with the other one, how do you put forth a plausible threat of lost business to your incumbent? As supplier industries have consolidated, these challenges have only metastasized in recent years. And so the shrinking universe of suppliers is increasingly emboldened. As suppliers see fewer competitors threatening their customer lists, we are now witnessing the emergence of increasingly hostile and anti-competitive supplier behaviors. A few examples: hostility to audit, even in the face of clear and customer-favoring audit rights provisions. Hostility to third-party management. Your suppliers are aware that an entire arena of solutions, we're a part of this arena, have emerged to help augment the in-house capabilities of ultra-lean procurement departments, and they have been trying to prevent customers from utilizing this arena. They prefer an overburdened customer lacking in category-specific expertise and technology. These are anti-competitive behaviors. And anti-competitive practices are easier to get away with when your list of viable competitors has shrunk from 5 to only 1 or 2. We now see these consolidated suppliers following the lead of their dwindling national competitors as they attempt to strip away their customers' rights. And we see this same following the lead with the margin grabbing increases I just referenced, far exceeding actual inflationary levels. In many industries, the suppliers don't even have to conspire and collude against their customers' interests in 2022. They simply have to note each other's practices and follow suit. So, of course, your suppliers reacted the way they did to the leaning out of procurement resources. And of course, they figured out how to penetrate the meager defenses provided by broad enterprise systems. Of course, they rendered good contracts less and less relevant. They're competing. The competitive market demands this of them. And the question now will be, how will procurement compete back? When you add it all up, diminished resources, well-honed supplier practices, fewer and fewer options due to consolidation, and increasingly anti-competitive behavior, the threat of lost business has been dramatically eroded, and it continues to erode in real time. And this brings me back to the harsh reality we laid out at the top. There's a massive power imbalance that prevails today, and it's a grand challenge for procurement to restore some balance between buyers and sellers. And I think that's what Phil, Kelly, and Helen want to talk about next.
Yeah, and apologies for jumping. I didn't mean to jump in there to wrap you up or anything like that. So I actually was making so many notes here that I actually will be struggling to read my handwriting of where to go first.
No worries, Rich. Oh, no worries, Phil. I'm Rich. I saw you back in, and I was eager to start talking. So let's
Yeah,
do.
we got a lot of questions. I will bring in Kelly and Helen in just one moment, but let me just see if there's a couple that I can bring up here. Let's see, here we go. So this question, the threat of lost business is a weapon that procurement can wield with suppliers, but stakeholders use switching costs and disruption against us. Are we stuck between a rock and a hard place?
Yeah. Yes is the answer. 100%. It is not easy. The challenges are grand. I've got some thoughts on potential solutions, but yes, indeed, you're often stuck between a rock and a hard place, and it's really demanding to find a way to not be.
Let's see what else we have here. I had one earlier that I saw that I just wanted to bring up. Here we go. This is something that actually Kelly and I were discussing just as you were coming back on stage. And that's, do you think that procurement sometimes overly uses power dynamics and leverage when a more collaborative approach would be more appropriate?
Well, it depends on who the questioner intends to be collaborating with. I think there is, and it's really a product of diminished resources. But I do think that there's less in the way of collaboration with teammates than there was 10, 15 years ago. You know, but I think you're supposed to use power dynamics and leverage.
Yep.
Goodness knows your vendors are. And so, that as you trace margin growth throughout the indirect supplier world over the last 15 years, it's quite clear they're using it pretty damn effectively. And so I would think figuring out what your power is and where your leverage points are and finding smart ways to use that's just engaging in the competition.
We've talked, it was interesting, you talked about data right at the beginning, how 2007, you're kind of looking at 2007 versus now. And actually, having access to more data was supposed to bring transparency to supplier relationships. And in fact, what it's tended to do, and this is what we're trying to help procurement counter today with all the different examples, is it's created even more of an asymmetry between the information that a buyer has and the seller has, so that the seller can use that against the buyer even more than perhaps 10, 15 years ago, when we thought, well, maybe this is actually going to be leveling the playing field.
Yeah, there's still ways I think that that emerging reality can be used to help level the playing field. I said earlier in my talk that the average procurement professional today is being asked to do the work of 2 to 3 people. The good news is there are tools and resources available to help make that possible. And I think one of my most critical suggestions to your listeners would be, you just have to be on the cutting edge and acutely aware of what those resources are, what's out there that can help me get more done. You're not going to work 80 hours a week. And if you're doing that, you should go start your own business. Don't work for somebody else working 80 hours a week, for crying out loud. And so, if you're working that, but if you're looking for ways to work smartly, you've got to be at the cutting edge of what's available to you that can augment your in-house capabilities.
We talk a lot about the role of procurement leader and the procurement professional, because it's both at the organization level, but it's also at the category level. Your role now is to be an architect. How can you architect the best insights, information, knowledge, everything that you can, and bring that together to create solutions and outcomes that support what your stakeholders want, that drive outcomes. It's not just about one thing now. There's this whole ecosystem of information and support that you can use. How do you choose? And it's almost like you're building Lego blocks, and you're building a big building out of these small blocks. Which are the blocks you're going to choose and where you're going to put them? That's really the role of the procurement person right now.
That's such a great analogy, Phil. I hadn't heard you share that before, but I think it's, and the architect, when they're designing a home, doesn't leave whole wings of the house kind of empty and blank and like we'll get to that later. They're designing the home.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the flaws that I often see within procurement departments today is that if you ask the average category manager who might own 10 categories, what are you working on now? You'd probably get a really good answer for the 2 or 3 categories that are right in their crosshairs.
Mm-hmm.
But if you followed up with the follow-up question what is your for the 7 or 8 categories you're not actively working on now?
Yeah.
Your answers would get much less impressive.
Yeah.
And, I think that being an architect involves having a strategy for everything
Yep.
that you're responsible for. And I think that is often an area where there's room for improvement. And it's also where suppliers have been feasting on overburdened procurement departments.
Yeah, we talk about overseeing 100% of spend globally. Overseeing doesn't mean that you're personally managing it all, but that you have, the strategies in place, that you're leveraging the tools you can use to make sure that you actually understand what's going on and that the right people are managing the right spend.
100%. Yeah.
I do want to bring in Helen and Kelly to the stream. So let me just add you both there, and let's bring you off mic. We talked earlier about this isn't all about problems and challenges. We want to talk solutions. I'm going to ask Kelly and Helen to jump in a moment or two to kind of help us have a little bit of a round robin for the remaining time in the session. But before I do that, let's talk solutions. What are some of the antidotes to the challenges that you laid out in the first portion of this conversation, Rich?
Well, it is hard, but I think there are a few. One big one that I often see, epic failures within is just preparation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so common for a procurement professional, especially a greener one, to enter into a process, or whether it's a negotiation, an RFP, without understanding the liabilities that they may have at the tail end of that process and the barriers that exist for them as of day one to effectively using the marketplace. Buyers don't spend enough time making themselves true free agents in the marketplace. They often just head off into a process and I'll just negotiate my way out of it. And, I don't care how much time you've spent on an RFP process that ends up yielding $1 million a year in savings. If your incumbent supplier is holding a $2 million liability over your head at the end of that process, you have wasted a pile of time. You're not going anywhere. And that supplier knew it all along. So I think preparation is a big one on the front end, and really understanding liabilities. And by the way, looking forward, even if you're not there, taking care of your successors, starting to prioritize the back end of agreements better, whether it's continuity of service and surety of service on the back end, minimizing liabilities in any way you can so that you can somehow become more of a free agent in this marketplace that's already difficult to navigate. Another one I would say is solidarity with team members. You may have plants in the field that say there is no scenario on God's green earth where I'm moving to supplier B up the street. That's okay. You just need to all agree that supplier can't know that, mm-hmm. especially if there are only 2 options. You need good solidarity with your teammates, everybody wearing the same jerseys. And then finally, another one that I think I regularly see procurement fall down in this respect is understanding category-specific logistics as it relates to what a transition might look like. Mm-hmm. Because you can't put forth a plausible threat of lost business to an incumbent supplier if you're 3 months from expiration, but it would take you 6 months to transition. You're too late. You've lost it. And your incumbent knows it, and they have no need to be competitive. And so, I think preparation, solidarity, understanding the logistics, and actually, walking through the steps of what a transition to a new supplier might look like, even if you have no intention of doing it, has value in making you more powerful in the marketplace. Those are 3 that come to mind right away.
Kelly, I want to bring you in. Any reaction, and possibly any questions based on what Rich was sharing there? I think we could probably between us all talk about this for the next hour or so. But I'd love to know your kind of immediate reaction and thoughts to what Rich is sharing.
Sure. My immediate reaction is actually more just based on the sound of what we heard Rich share as much as it does the words, right? And I think we heard a similar dynamic in most of the other sessions. Yes, it's hard. but we've trained for this. Get out of our way. We choose this, even though it's a difficult challenge, because someone has to do this on behalf of companies. And so I think my follow-on question to that observation, Rich, would be, where do you find the core element in your mindset that you think allows you to look at the complexity and the challenges that we face today and sort of run forward instead of falling back? You know, in the earlier session, we talked about goldfish versus elephant around memory. I would say this is sort of an Eeyore versus Buzz Lightyear, right? How do we get procurement to choose the Buzz Lightyear approach as opposed to the like, oh, gee, my job is so hard kind of Eeyore approach?
What an interesting question. And it does tap into the, you know, the psyche of the kind of the personality profile that gravitates to procurement, a skeptic, a cynic, an analytical type, as opposed to a necessarily a visionary. And we're all a mix of,
and sarcastic. You forgot sarcastic. That's important.
Sure, sarcastic too. Yeah, and of course, there's a different, wide range of different awesome personality types in this field. But skepticism is a common trait, I think. And you know, look, there's a term called solution aversion that is, I believe it means that when the problem seems too grand, there's a tendency not to even want to consider the solutions and more just do the ostrich thing of burying your head in the sand, as opposed to try to face it. How do I do it? I mean, look, it's the old one bite at a time kind of thing, you know, but I think you do have to look for ways. You know, you guys have had a ton of people attend today, and part of the reason I structured my talk the way I did was I think there's not a whole lot of activism in the procurement community as a whole. You think of activism as revolving around climate change or equal rights. And yet there are causes here that are shared by everybody who comes and listens to your content. And I really think that there should be stronger activism among your community in terms of collectively defending their interests. You know, and by the way, if I could give a shout to a couple of groups that I think your listeners should go check out. You know, there's the U.S. here. There's an awesome firm out there that does anti-monopoly and anti-competitive behavior advocacy called the American Economic Liberties Project, led by a guy named Matt Stoller. It's a DC outfit. They put out amazing content. I subscribe to his Substack. It's great information. There's also Access to Markets, which is a sister of the American Economic Liberties Project, headed by Denise Hearn and Nidhi Hegde, also doing great work in the anti-monopoly space. And this is the kind of activism. I mean, these folks are like working there kind of in procurement's interest. Yeah. And I think there should be more involvement and it starts with awareness, of course. Like how does this industry consolidation, how does this huge acquisition affect me in the marketplace? Do I like it or not like it? And if I don't like it, what are the things I can do? You know, you don't tend to think of there being much in the way of activism in procurement, but maybe there should be.
You know, Helen, do you think that we should be advocating more for ourselves and for our profession within procurement, that perhaps we're a little bit quiet in terms of we kind of put our heads down, get on with the job, but we don't necessarily try and advocate for ourselves?
Well, I think Richard's point about being proactive and engaging, where, you know, it can make a difference in terms of that balance between, you know, regulation and non-regulation in a marketplace. You know, we've got quite a big discussion going on in the UK at the moment about the utilities and water markets, particularly in England. And, you know, it's that balance between whether it's a free for all or whether there is some regulation. And you know, if there is a move towards monopolies, and you know, that's a tech discussion as well, isn't it? Is that something where actually procurement could be advocating more, could be actually contributing with some of our data about what that market dynamic actually means in terms of the ability to do business, the ability for there to be fair competition and barriers to entry, I suppose, and that stifles innovation. So I think I would be on Rich's camp on that. I think the trouble is finding the time to do that, and that's the big challenge. And we talked about people working 80 hours a week, or, you know, workload increasing. So, you know, these are the sort of icing on the cake type things we talk about sometimes, where, you know, just seeing what the next price rise that's come in the inbox and that you've got to deal with is the real world, isn't it? So it's quite a hard challenge to find the time to do those pieces of work.
I agree, Helen. I think there's both tactical things that people can get better with, and we've alluded to a few of those, and certainly, just to me, it all gets summarized by engage in the joust with your suppliers. There is a competition going on, and bringing a competitive spirit to each day, is certainly critical to success in this world. And then there's the grander scheme, the bigger picture, the activism. That's more the community stuff. But and I think there can be some uptick in that without it coming to dominate people's lives. Nobody's asking procurement to take to the streets or whatever. But I think there should be more of that to some extent. But there's certainly a lot of the solutions revolve around smart tactics, remaining at the cutting edge of solutions that are available to help people augment resources and do a better job of engaging in the joust.
Now we've got probably 4 or 5 minutes remaining, and we were talking about monopolies, so I wanted to pose this question. Do you have any tips on making sure we don't create a monopoly because of the sourcing decisions we make? Because there's on one hand, I think the question comes from there are situations, and we've talked about situations where there are true monopolies because suppliers are buying suppliers, they're creating monopolistic situations. But there are other times where we're effectively creating a monopoly because of a sourcing decision we made, because perhaps that's short-sightedness. And just any response or thinking around how can we proactively make sure we don't get ourselves in a situation where we regret once the contract is signed?
It's an interesting question. It sounds like that question comes from a listener who works at a very large company, because most buyers at mid-level outfits would not necessarily have that thought. I hadn't anticipated that question, to be honest, and I certainly would think my advice would be, if you're entering into a sourcing decision that's so grand that it has the potential to do that, that is certainly a process that you should measure twice to cut once and handle with kid gloves. And even if it looks efficacious in the short run, there's likely going to be some long-term blowback that should be strongly considered in that process. Because as a general rule, anything like a monopoly is not good for the buyer.
No, and there could be times when we make a sourcing award that is a long-term commitment that ties us into effectively a single source. And by doing that, you've created a monopoly for yourself where you didn't even need to, because now you've got no optionality and the supplier knows it. So then that's where, the leverage comes in. Again, the supplier has the leverage.
Yeah, it's true. And those kind of decisions tend to get made when the short term is given outsized value over the long term. And I think that's a great market inefficiency that suppliers can feast upon, is giving away, whatever it is that the buyer who needs to make his or her numbers in the short term needs, and extract, orders of magnitude more than that concession over time. And of course, they've built good strategies for eroding whatever concession anyway. So the concessions won't last long to begin with. But yeah, you make a good point, Phil.
And I have one more question for you, Rich. But I first of all want to ask Kelly, do you have anything else that you would like to pose to Rich while we're in the session?
I do, actually. So, Rich, I want to challenge you on your activism notion, because I was thinking back to the session that I did with Bob Schreiner earlier, and he used this phrase that I think is just fantastic. He talked about catalyst for conversation. So much of what we're seeing happen now is not even necessarily things happening, but it's forcing us to have hard conversations, impactful conversations, complicated conversations. And I think those conversations can be a form of activism in and of themselves. So given your mindset, which is clearly very dynamic around what procurement can do, how would you challenge us to take the idea of activism, but apply it a little bit more broadly so that it affects our mindset, it affects how we come to meetings, what we ask of suppliers, what we say to suppliers? How do we sort of take activism into a soft skills kind of space?
Yeah, maybe let me be clear. For me, the activism starts with just awareness, like consuming information about the grand scale things that affect the procurement practitioner, becoming more deeply immersed in in those issues, and over time forming opinions. And so it's a long game. I am not talking about tomorrow becoming, I'm more saying tomorrow, start reading this stuff, start following, the way mergers and acquisitions are impacting your ability, and reflect a little bit. Like, if you've worked in have I lost a bit of the threat of lost business? Is that a harder weapon to wield today in the marketplace than it was years ago? I suspect the answer is yes. And if it is, then why? And what can I do about it? And maybe get a little more involved in following what causes these things to happen. And over time, perhaps even doing whatever occurs to you to do on an individual basis to help defend your own interests. I don't think there's anything about that that's mutually exclusive with what you're saying. And in fact, I think both are totally healthy.
No, I think they are too. And I think it might even be, I'm here to have this conversation. And traditionally, I would prep this way and say these things and ask those questions. But maybe, and I know we're going to talk about this soon, if we think about pushing ourselves to that next level, an activist approach might be asking the supplier one more question. What do you think about? What have you observed regarding? I think that curiosity, that willing to stay fully engaged in the meeting and ask the open-ended questions. I guess to me, what I'm saying is, I wouldn't have thought it right out of the gate, but when I compare what you've said to what I heard Bob Schreiner say earlier, to me, those two ideas actually connect. That information exchange through conversation is also a form of value-oriented activism.
Yeah, but be real careful about the timing of your conversations with your suppliers, and do the preparation first. Know your liabilities, because rest assured they do.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've probably gone past time, but I want to ask you one last question. That's a bit of a quick fire question, Rich. We're always talking about taking action here at Art of Procurement. So if there's one thing that participants today should do following this session to really drive value with all the disruption that's going on around us, do you have one little tidbit that you want to leave everybody with?
Oh, Phil, I behave so badly when I'm asked for the one thing, because my answer is always there are 30 things.
Yes.
And I there was who was it? It's a one of my favorite quotes of all time. Mencken, maybe it was to every complex problem there is a solution that is simple, straightforward, and wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I cannot give you one answer,
right,
but I can tell you, get better tactically, preparation, solidarity, understanding the logistics, staying at the cutting edge of what's available to augment what you've got, what what your resources are. Mm-hmm. And then bigger picture, become aware of the grand scale forces, the headwinds that you're, kind of swimming upstream against, and try to come to understand them better than maybe you historically have, and perhaps, take positions when it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rich, I want to thank you so much for sharing the benefit of your advice, wisdom, experience with our audience here at Category Palooza 2022. We really appreciate the conversation. I haven't got through a fraction of the notes that I wrote, so
let's talk again offline sometime soon, Phil. I enjoy the chats.
But I really appreciate your time, and thanks, Helen, and thanks, Kelly, for joining me in this session. We will go to a wrap up in a second as we say goodbye to Rich, Helen, and Kelly. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us in our Category Palooza 2022 event. We've had such a good time putting this together for you. Hopefully you've come out of it with a lot of new insights, or with, looking at things that you've heard others doing that has validated or verified strategies that you have. We're always hoping and wanting to help. So if there's anything that came out of any of today's sessions, any additional questions, we've captured a lot of the questions that came in throughout the day. So we're going to be, putting our heads together on how we turn those into content so we can help you with some of the answers that we weren't able to bring to you on stage. I want to thank our sponsors for making Category Palooza 2022 possible. I want to thank Fine Tune, Expense Management, Procurement IQ, and Spend Pros. Of course, there's a lot that goes into creating events like this. And so we wouldn't be able to put on events for the Art of Procurement community without their support. And so for that, I am extremely grateful. Now, as we are wrapping up here, there is just one last thing to say, because, you know, each one of the events that we have, and events like Category Palooza, we build around a different theme. And, you know, today was all around really understanding categories, understanding how we can respond to a lot of the changes that are going on around us from a category perspective, you know, how to manage against the inflation and the volatility in supply, and how do we get the data that puts us in the kind of the driving seat when we're having conversations with our suppliers. We actually have our next event that's going to be coming up, which is Mastermind Live, and that's in fall 2022 for October the 4th and October the 5th. So at Mastermind Live, our topic is going to be around how can we 10x the impact of procurement. 10xing the impact of procurement is something that we're really passionate about at Art of Procurement, and we're on a mission to help, you know, between ourselves and between all the different constituents within procurement, you know, how can we collectively really exponentially increase the impact that we all have on within our businesses. And so we're going to be exploring that theme and a lot of different topics around that theme at AOP Mastermind Live 2022. You can register right now. The registration page is open. So if you have enjoyed today's session, we'd love to see you at Mastermind Live. Just go to artofprocurement.com/mastermindlive and you'll go to that registration page. One last time, I want to thank everybody. It's such so much work goes on behind the scenes to put together an event like this, especially when it's 100% live. We're using technology that we haven't used before until today. You know, there are things that we'll take away as our lessons learned to make sure that next time our events are even more impactful. But we'd love your feedback, always looking for feedback on what you liked and perhaps what you think we could do better, because really we're putting these events on for you. So if you would like to give us any feedback, you could always just go to artofprocurement.com/contact, fill in the contact form, or contact us across any of the channels. We're always visible. You'll see us on LinkedIn all the time, on Twitter, anywhere. We'll definitely take feedback that you might have, or just email us. So with that being said, I want to one last time say thank you to you all, and we can't wait to see you again soon. Take care, everybody.